Welcome back to Void of Fears. Before we jump into today's story, I've got to ask for a quick favour. If you could smash that like button, drop a comment below, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It seriously makes a huge difference. YouTube's algorithm loves that stuff, and it pushes my videos to new viewers who might dig these stories too. I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. It means the world to me and helps keep this channel growing. Alright, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. My name is Thomas Granger, and what I'm about to tell you happened 3 months ago. I'm 38 years old, and for the past 15 years, I've been documenting the forgotten corners of World War II. Not the famous battles or celebrated heroes that fill history books, but the classified projects, the buried experiments, the secrets that powerful people wanted, erased from memory forever. My apartment looks like the workspace of a madman. Every wall is covered with maps marking abandoned bunkers, forgotten research facilities, mass graves, and classified installations across Europe. Red pins mark locations I've explored. Yellow pins mark places I'm investigating. Black pins mark the sites where something went wrong, where my research hit walls of classification and denial that suggested something far darker than anyone wanted to admit. Most people call it an obsession, and they're probably right, but there's something about those shadows of history that calls to me, demanding to be brought into the light. Every buried document, every sealed file, every witness who suddenly stops talking tells me that the real horrors of the war were never documented. They were hidden. 3 months ago, everything changed. I came home from a research trip to find an envelope that had been slipped under my door. No postmark, no return address, no indication of how it had gotten there. The paper inside looked ancient, torn from something much older. The edges were brown with age, and the ink had faded to a colour that reminded me uncomfortably of dried blood. It was a hand-drawn map showing coordinates deep in the Bavarian forest, near the Austrian border. The cartography was precise, professional, marked with symbols I didn't recognise, and notations in what looked like multiple languages. At the bottom, written in careful German script, were the words verboten, nicht eintreten, forbidden, do not enter. Below that, in different handwriting that looked more recent, someone had added, Sie warten immer noch, seit 1943. They are still waiting, since 1943. I should have burned the map, should have forgotten about it, should have chosen literally any other response than what I did. Instead, I spent 3 weeks researching the coordinates. Satellite imagery showed nothing but dense forest. Historical records showed the area had been classified as a military zone during the war, but no details about what kind of installation had been there. Local archives had gaps in their records spanning from 1942 to 1946, as if someone had carefully removed every document related to that time period. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that this was exactly the kind of discovery I'd been searching for my entire career. A facility so classified that it had been erased from official history. The kind of place where the real horrors had happened. I called my crew. Evan Morrison had been my sound engineer for 5 years. He was a natural skeptic who questioned every strange noise and debunked every shadow, and his rational mind had saved me from embarrassing myself more times than I could count. He'd grown up in military family and had an engineer's understanding of how things worked, which made him invaluable when exploring abandoned installations. Lila Chen was my camera woman and oldest friend. We'd known each other since film school, and she had an artist's eye for making even the darkest bunker look cinematic. More importantly, she understood the weight of documenting history, the responsibility of bearing witness to things that others wanted forgotten. Dominik Volkov was a translator and amateur historian who spoke 7 languages and had spent his childhood in post-war Germany exploring ruins with his grandfather. his knowledge of Nazi administrative structure and classification systems had been essential to previous investigations. We met at my apartment on a rainy Thursday evening to plan the expedition. When I showed them the map, Dominic went pale in a way I'd never seen before. "Thomas," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "where exactly did you get this?" "Someone left it for me. Why? Do you recognize it?" He pointed to the phrase at the bottom with a shaking finger, this saying, "Sie warten immer noch." My grandfather used to wake up screaming these words. He was conscripted to work in a research facility during the war, somewhere in Bavaria. He never told us what he saw there, but sometimes at night he'd have episodes where he'd barricade his bedroom door and whisper that phrase over and over until dawn. Evan frowned at the map. This is exactly the setup of every horror movie where everyone dies. Anonymous maps leading to forbidden places. Come on, Thomas. This feels like someone's playing a game with you. Or someone wants the truth to come out, I countered. Think about it. If you had knowledge of something terrible that happened during the war, something that was classified and buried, how would you get that information to someone who could document it? You'd find a researcher with a reputation for uncovering hidden history. Lila was already studying the map with her filmmaker's eye. The detail work is incredible. This isn't some hoax drawn on aged paper. These markings, these symbols, they're consistent with military cartography from the 1940s. Someone with serious knowledge made this. Despite Evan's reservations, we were all intrigued. I booked our flights for the following week. We landed in Munich on a cold October morning under a sky the colour of old concrete. The rental car's GPS couldn't find the coordinates, so we had to navigate using the hand-drawn landmarks on the map. We drove southeast for 4 hours, through villages that seemed frozen in time, their windows dark and their streets empty, even in the middle of the day. The people we encountered were strange. When we stopped for gas, the attendant's eyes went wide when he saw our destination on the map. He spoke rapidly in German to Dominic, who grew increasingly pale during the conversation. "What did he say?" I asked as we got back in the car. "He said that area has been forbidden since his grandfather's time. The people who go into that forest don't come back the same. Some don't come back at all." The road grew narrower as we climbed into the mountains. The villages became smaller, more isolated, until we were driving through settlements that looked like they'd been abandoned for decades. Empty houses with boarded windows lined streets where no one walked. Finally, the paved road ended at a rusted gate chained shut with a sign that made Dominic step back from the car. "Lebensgefahr," he translated, his voice tight. "Mortal danger." And below that it says the area is contaminated and entry is prohibited by federal law. We parked and prepared for the hike. The forest was visible beyond the gate, and even from a distance, something about it looked wrong. The trees grew too uniformly, in perfect rows, as if they'd been planted rather than grown naturally, and the silence was absolute. No bird calls, no insect sounds, no rustling of leaves in the wind. We climbed over the gate and hiked the final 3 miles on foot. The further we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Every few hundred yards, we found more warning signs. Most were too faded to read completely, but I caught glimpses of words that made my skin crawl. Quarantine. Biological contamination. Authorized personnel only. "How old are these signs?" Lila asked, filming one that showed a skull and crossbones above text in 3 languages. Dominic examined the metal and typography. "The style is definitely wartime, but the metal hasn't aged as much as it should have. Someone's been maintaining these." The trees grew denser as we followed the map's careful notations. Branches interwove overhead, blocking out most of the afternoon sun and creating a permanent twilight that forced us to use flashlights, even at 3 in the afternoon. The air had a chemical smell that burned the back of my throat and made my eyes water. There was something else in that smell, something organic and rotten that seemed to cling to my clothes and skin, something that reminded me of the specimen preservation rooms in medical schools. But worse, much worse. Then we found it. Hidden beneath decades of fallen leaves and moss was a metal hatch exactly as shown on the map. It was built flush with the ground and camouflaged to blend with the forest floor, but someone had been maintaining it. The metal was rusted but structurally sound, and when I brushed away the debris, I could see that the hinges had been recently oiled. Welded into the centre was a swastika, and below it, stamped in Gothic letters, Kammer 12, Annenebe Forschungsgruppe, Operative Thule, Chamber 12, Ancestral Heritage Research Group, Operation Thule. My blood ran cold. I knew those names. The Annenebe was Heinrich Himmler's occult research division, responsible for some of the most disturbing experiments of the war. They'd searched for mystical artifacts, conducted genetic experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics, and delved into areas of research that even other Nazi scientists found troubling. But Operation Thule was something else entirely. I'd found references to it in classified documents, always heavily redacted, always associated with projects that had been terminated and buried. The few fragments I'd pieced together suggested experiments that went far beyond conventional weapons research into areas that bordered on the impossible. "This is it," I whispered, setting up the camera with shaking hands. "This is the discovery of a lifetime." The lock was massive, clearly designed to keep something contained rather than keep people out. It took us 4 hours with bolt cutters, a blowtorch, and a portable angle grinder to break through the multiple locking mechanisms. The metal was thicker than it appeared, and some of the internal mechanisms were made of alloys I didn't recognize. When the hatch finally opened, the smell that rushed out knocked us all backward. This wasn't just the mustiness of a sealed space. This was the concentrated essence of decay, mixed with chemicals that made my sinuses burn, and something organic that seemed to move through the air like a living thing. Lila vomited violently into the bushes. Evan, who'd explored dozens of abandoned facilities with me, looked ready to flee back to the car. Even I had to fight the urge to slam the hatch shut and pretend we'd never found it. "We can't go down there," Lila gasped, wiping her mouth. "Thomas, whatever's down there has been sealed for 80 years for a reason. The smell alone could be toxic." But I was already shining my flashlight into the opening, and what I saw made my heart race with excitement and terror. Concrete steps descended into perfect darkness, disappearing beyond the reach of our lights. The walls were covered with a dark substance that glistened wetly in the flashlight beam, and I could see that the stairway extended much deeper than any bunker I'd explored before. "Just a quick reconnaissance," I promised. 1 hour down, document what we can, then we're out. This could be the most significant historical discovery in decades." The stairs were steep and seemed to go on forever. Our footsteps echoed strangely in the narrow shaft, creating a rhythm that almost sounded like distant marching. The walls were rough concrete, but embedded throughout were objects that shouldn't have been there. Fragments of bone that looked both human and decidedly not human. Metal implements that might have been surgical instruments or torture devices. And everywhere, that dark stain that seemed to shift and move when caught in our peripheral vision. The air grew thicker as we descended, heavy with moisture and chemicals that made breathing difficult. My equipment readings showed atmospheric composition that was technically breathable, but far from normal. Elevated levels of nitrogen, unusual trace gases, and something my instruments couldn't identify at all. After what felt like 20 minutes of continuous descent, we reached a landing with a heavy door. This wasn't the rusted metal I'd expected from a Nazi facility. This door was pristine, made of some kind of black alloy that seemed to absorb our flashlight beams rather than reflect them. The surface was covered with inscriptions in multiple languages, and the locking mechanism was unlike anything I'd seen in other German installations. It was a complex arrangement of wheels, gears, and symbols that looked more ceremonial than practical. Some of the components appeared to be made of materials that weren't metal at all, but something organic that had been hardened and shaped. "This is not standard Wehrmacht engineering," Dominic said, running his hands over the inscriptions. "These symbols, this construction technique, it's like they were combining German industrial methods with something much older. It took all four of us working together to operate the locking mechanism." The wheels turned with surprising smoothness, as if they'd been maintained recently. And when the final tumbler clicked into place, the doors swung open with a sound like a massive intake of breath. That's when the lights came on. Not all at once, but in sequence, flickering to life throughout the corridor beyond, like synapses firing in a vast nervous system. Not the harsh fluorescence you'd expect from a military installation, but a dim, sickly yellow glow that pulsed with an almost organic rhythm. "The power's still on," Evan whispered, his voice tight with disbelief. "After 80 years, this place still has power." We entered slowly, documenting everything. The corridor beyond defied every principle of German engineering I'd studied. Nazi construction was typically efficient, practical, designed for function over form. This was something else entirely. The passages branched off at angles that seemed mathematically wrong, creating perspectives that hurt to look at directly. The ceiling height varied randomly, sometimes opening into cathedral-like spaces, other times forcing us to duck our heads. And the walls were covered with metal panels, each one inscribed with markings that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't focusing directly on them. The ambient sound was wrong too. Beneath the electrical hum was a rhythmic pulsing that seemed to come from the facility itself, like a massive heart beating somewhere in the depths of the installation. The pulse was slow and steady, but occasionally it would skip or accelerate, as if responding to our presence. We took the main passage, documenting everything we encountered. The first rooms we explored were clearly medical in nature, but designed for subjects much larger than human. Operating tables 15 feet long, with restraint systems built for limbs that could span a grown man's height. Surgical instruments that looked more like industrial equipment than medical tools. And everywhere, that same dark stain covering the walls and floors in patterns that almost looked intentional. "What were they operating on?" Lila whispered, her camera capturing the oversized equipment. "These tables, these restraints, they're built for something enormous." In one room, we found an entire wall covered with surgical tools, each one custom-made and labelled in German, but the labels described procedures that weren't in any medical textbook: cranial extension, limb elongation, organ multiplication, consciousness transferal. The next room contained dozens of cages arranged in careful rows. They ranged from the size of dog kennels to enclosures large enough to hold an elephant, but all of them shared the same disturbing characteristics. The bars were scratched and bent from the inside. Several had been torn completely apart by something with incredible strength, and all of them were stained with the same dark substance that covered the walls. But it was the smaller cages that disturbed me most. They were built for something human-sized, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too narrow, as if designed for bodies that had been stretched or modified. The floor of each cage was covered with scratches that formed patterns, almost like primitive writing. "Look at this," Dominic called from across the room. He was examining a metal plaque, mounted between two of the larger cages. "It's a feeding schedule, but the quantities, the substances they were feeding these things, it's not for any animal I know of." The schedule listed feeding times and portions that would be appropriate for creatures the size of large horses, but the substances were horrifying. Blood, certainly, but also human tissue, organs, and other materials that made my stomach turn, and all of it was noted with the clinical precision of a scientific experiment. We found a laboratory filled with glass chambers, each one numbered and dated. Most were empty, but a few still contained their subjects. In Chamber 7 we found something that had once been human. The skeleton was elongated beyond anything natural, the skull stretched to twice normal length, and the rib cage expanded to accommodate organs that should never have existed. But it was Chamber 12 that made us all step back in horror. The skeleton inside was blackened as if by incredible heat, but the burn marks weren't random. They radiated outward in perfect geometric patterns, suggesting the heat had come from within the subject itself, and fused to the back wall of the chamber were objects that looked like they might have been organs, but expanded and modified beyond recognition. The interior of the glass was covered with scratches that formed clear, deliberate patterns, not random damage, but communication. And when Dominic translated the markings, his face went white. "They're coordinates," he said quietly. "Locations all over Europe, dozens of them." "Coordinates to what? Other chambers, other facilities. This isn't an isolated experiment, Thomas. This was part of something much larger." The implications hit me like a physical blow. If Kammer 12 was one installation in a network of similar facilities, then what we were seeing was just a small piece of something vast and horrifying. Something that had been operating across occupied Europe, conducting experiments that went far beyond anything in the historical record. "We need to document everything," I said, but my voice was shaking. "This could rewrite our understanding of what really happened during the war." We descended to a lower level, using a service elevator that shouldn't have been functional but responded to our button press with smooth, silent operation. The cables looked new, the mechanisms well maintained, as if someone had been servicing the equipment recently. The lower level was different in every way. The temperature dropped 20 degrees the moment the elevator doors opened, and our breath immediately began to fog. The lighting here was harsh white fixtures that buzzed and flickered, creating strobing shadows that seemed to move independently of our movements. The corridors on this level were narrower, more maze-like, with passages that branched and converged in patterns that defied logical navigation. Several times we had to backtrack when routes led to dead ends or rooms that were sealed with iron doors welded shut from the outside. The metal was still warm to the touch, suggesting recent welding. Dominic managed to translate the door markings, and each translation made the implications clearer and more terrifying. Übertragungsraum, transfer room, Bewusstseinsbeobachtung, consciousness observation, subject 8, erfolgreich, subject 8, successful. Successful at what? Lila asked, but none of us wanted to speculate. We found a room filled with equipment I'd never seen before. Machines that looked like a cross between medical devices and medieval torture instruments, all connected by cables and tubes to a central apparatus that hummed with electrical power. The controls were labelled in German, but also in symbols that didn't match any written language I knew. On a metal table in the centre of the room was a logbook, still open to the last entry. The date was October 15th, 1943, and the text was in German. Dominic translated as he read, "Subject 17 shows continued adaptation to the modification process. Limb elongation proceeding within acceptable parameters. Cranial expansion allowing for enhanced neural capacity as predicted. Most importantly, the consciousness transfer protocol achieved 73% retention during today's session. Subject maintains memories and personality while demonstrating complete compliance to command structures. Recommend proceeding to final phase of Operation Tula. If Subject 17 maintains stability for another 48 hours, we will have achieved proof of concept for the mass production of enhanced personnel. The Reich's 1,000-year empire will be built not just with superior technology, but with superior beings created in our image. The entry was signed with a name that made my blood run cold. Dr. Johann Weiss, Chief of Biological Enhancement, Arnhenberg Special Projects Division. I'd seen that name before, in fragments of classified documents. Weiss had been one of the architects of the Nazis' most extreme experiments, a man who disappeared at the end of the war, and was rumoured to have escaped to South America. But if this logbook was authentic, he'd been working on projects that went far beyond anything in the historical record. "Thomas," Lila's voice was tight with fear. "We need to leave, now. This place, these experiments. They're not just historical artifacts. Someone's been maintaining this equipment. Someone's been keeping the lights on." But I couldn't stop. Every room revealed new horrors, new evidence of experiments that had pushed the boundaries of human possibility. This wasn't just a research facility. This was a factory for creating something that wasn't quite human, but wasn't quite anything else either. We continued deeper into the maze, following corridors that seemed to shift and change when we weren't looking directly at them. The facility was larger than any bunker complex I'd ever explored, extending much further than should have been possible, given the surface topology. Finally, we found the mannequin room. It was a vast circular space, maybe 60 feet in diameter, filled with hundreds of human-shaped figures, arranged in concentric rings around the room's centre. At first glance, they looked like medical training dummies, each one covered in a pale material that felt disturbingly realistic to the touch. But as we moved our lights across them, the wrongness became apparent in ways that made my mind struggle to process what I was seeing. These weren't mannequins. They were casts, moulds taken from living subjects, but those subjects hadn't been human, at least not entirely. The proportions were wrong in ways that created a deep, instinctive revulsion. Arms that hung too low, reaching nearly to the ground. Torsos that were stretched vertically to impossible lengths. Legs that had too many joints, allowing them to bend in directions that violated human anatomy. And the hands had fingers that were far too long, with additional joints that would allow for movements no human hand could achieve. But it was the faces that were most disturbing, or rather, the complete absence of faces. Each figure had a smooth, blank surface where features should have been, as if the faces had been deliberately removed or never existed in the first place. "Thomas," Lila's voice was barely a whisper. "That one by the wall. When we came in, wasn't it positioned differently?" I looked where she was pointing. The figure stood with its featureless face turned toward us, its elongated arms hanging at its sides, in a position that seemed almost expectant. I tried to remember how it had been positioned when we'd entered the room, but the harder I focused, the less certain I became. "We need to keep moving," I said, but my voice cracked with uncertainty. As we prepared to leave, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the centre of the room, where all the figures seemed to be facing, was a circular depression in the floor. It was filled with the same dark stain we'd seen throughout the facility, but this stain was different, fresh, still wet, and in the centre of the liquid was a handprint, human-sized but with fingers that extended far beyond normal proportions. The print was recent enough that moisture still clung to the edges. Someone or something had been in this room very recently. We left the mannequin room as quickly as possible, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The sense of observation was so strong it felt like a physical presence, and several times I turned around expecting to see one of the figures following us. The deeper we went into the facility, the more the environment seemed to respond to our presence. The rhythmic pulsing grew louder, more insistent. The lights flickered in patterns that almost seemed like communication. The temperature continued to drop until every breath was visible, and the moisture in the air began to condense on the walls in patterns that looked almost like writing. We passed rooms filled with equipment I couldn't identify. Machines that looked like they'd been designed by someone who understood principles of physics that hadn't been discovered yet. Devices that hummed with power but had no visible energy source. Control panels covered with symbols that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. In one room, we found tanks filled with a dark liquid that moved with its own current, swirling in patterns that defied the laws of fluid dynamics. The liquid was warm to the touch, and when I held my flashlight close to the surface, I could see shapes moving within it. Organic shapes that looked almost like developing embryos, but wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. "Don't touch it," Dominic warned urgently. "That's not water. That's not any natural substance. Look at how it moves." He was right. The liquid seemed to have a consciousness of its own, responding to our presence by forming tendrils that reached toward us before settling back into its container. And the smell that rose from the surface was the same organic decay we'd been breathing since entering the facility, but concentrated to an almost overwhelming degree. Finally, after what felt like hours of exploration, we reached what could only be the central chamber. The corridor opened into a vast circular room with a domed ceiling that disappeared into darkness above. The space was enormous, easily large enough to hold a cathedral, and every surface was covered with the inscribed panels we'd seen throughout the facility. But these inscriptions were different, deeper, more complex, carved with a precision that suggested they weren't just decorative, but functional. In the center of the room stood a massive glass enclosure, maybe 20 feet in diameter and just as tall. The glass was thick, designed to contain something under enormous pressure, and a complex network of tubes ran from the base up into the ceiling, carrying fluids that pulsed with the same rhythm as the facility's heartbeat. Frost clung to the inside of the glass, despite the warmth of the surrounding room, and condensation ran down the walls in streams that collected in channels carved into the floor. But it was what was suspended inside the enclosure that made us all freeze in absolute terror. Something huge hung in the center of the chamber, held upright by a sophisticated system of cables, clamps, and support structures that looked more like life support than restraints. At first, I thought it might be another cast, another mold like the ones we'd found in the display room. But as we approached, the horrible truth became clear. This thing was alive. Not conscious, perhaps, but definitely alive. The body was humanoid but transformed beyond anything that should be possible. The limbs were elongated to impossible proportions, arms that would drag on the ground if it stood upright, legs that looked like they had been stretched on a medieval rack. The torso was bloated and distended, expanded to accommodate organs that shouldn't exist. The skin was the color of old parchment, so pale it was almost translucent, and I could see dark veins pulsing beneath the surface. The veins formed patterns, networks that seemed too organized to be natural, and where the major vessels converged, the skin glowed with a faint phosphorescence that pulsed in rhythm with the creature's breathing. But it was the head that made Lila scream and stumble backward into Evan's arms. The skull was enormous, easily twice the size of a human head, elongated and covered with the same dark veins that ran throughout its body. But it was the eyes that created the real horror. They had been sewn shut with thick, black thread in patterns that formed intricate designs across the lids. The stitching was precise, ritualistic, and it was clear that the procedure had been performed while the creature was alive. But even with the threads holding the lids closed, I could see movement beneath them. The eyes were active, tracking our movements despite being sealed shut. And occasionally the threads would strain, as if something behind them was trying to break free. The chest had been carved with deep incisions that formed symbols and patterns across the entire torso. The cuts were precise, deliberate, and they glowed with the same faint light as the veins. The symbols seemed to shift and change when I looked at them directly, rearranging themselves into new configurations that my mind struggled to process. As Evan moved closer with his recording equipment, the creature's breathing pattern changed. The slow, steady rhythm became rapid and shallow. The dark fluid in the tubes began flowing faster, and the frost on the glass started to melt and reform in different patterns. The symbols carved into its chest began to glow brighter, pulsing faster as if responding to our presence, and from somewhere deep in its throat came a sound that shouldn't have been possible, a low, harmonic tone that seemed to resonate in my bones, creating vibrations that I could feel in my teeth and skull. "It's waking up," Dominic whispered, his voice filled with terror. "Whatever we've done, whatever our presence here has triggered, it's waking up." Then it opened its eyes, even with the thread still holding the lids, partially closed. I could see what lay beneath. Not the white and iris of normal eyes, but something that looked like liquid mercury, constantly moving and shifting. The surface was reflective but also luminous, creating patterns of light that seemed to communicate meaning beyond words. And when that gaze turned toward us, I felt something fundamental break in my mind. The intelligence behind those eyes wasn't human. It was something vast and ancient and hungry, something that had been waiting in the dark for decades for someone to witness its awakening. The creature's mouth opened slowly, revealing teeth that belonged to no earthly animal. Multiple rows of elongated incisors, designed for tearing and shredding, gleamed with saliva that glowed with the same phosphorescence as its veins. And from deep in its throat came a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Multiple voices speaking in perfect harmony, but in a language that predated human speech by eons. The words formed patterns of meaning that bypassed my conscious mind and spoke directly to something primal and terrified deep in my brain. And as the creature spoke, the symbols carved into its chest began to rearrange themselves, forming new patterns that hurt to look at directly. That's when the alarm started, not modern electronic alarms, but mechanical sirens that wheezed and wailed like dying animals. The sound came from speakers hidden throughout the facility, echoing through every corridor we'd travelled. The noise was overwhelming, designed not just to alert but to disorient and terrify. And with the alarms came other sounds. The unmistakable noise of heavy doors slamming shut throughout the facility, mechanical locks engaging, security protocols activating. We were being sealed inside. The inscriptions on the walls, Dominic shouted over the noise, pointing to the panels surrounding the central chamber. They're not just decorative, they're instructions, incantations, and Thomas, when you were reading them out loud as we explored, you activated something. In my excitement at documenting our discoveries, I'd been unconsciously vocalizing the text on the walls, trying to puzzle out pronunciation and meaning. But these weren't words meant for human voices. They were something else entirely. A language that carried power in its very syllables. The creature in the glass prison was fully conscious now, straining against its restraints with strength that made the reinforced cables creak and snap. The dark fluid was pumping so fast it looked like arterial blood, and the symbols carved into its chest were glowing bright enough to illuminate the entire chamber. But, worse than that, we could hear something else responding to the alarms. Footsteps. Heavy, dragging footsteps coming from multiple directions throughout the facility, and breathing. Not the creature's breathing, but something else, multiple somethings, all breathing in perfect synchronization. The sounds were getting closer, converging on our location from every corridor we'd explored. Whatever we had awakened, it wasn't alone. "Run," Dominic said simply, his voice barely audible over the alarms. "Run now, or we're all dead." We ran like our lives depended on it, because they absolutely did. The corridors seemed different now, changed in ways that defied the maps we'd been carefully maintaining. Passages we hadn't seen before branched off from familiar routes. The facility was larger than we'd realized, or perhaps it was growing, expanding to accommodate whatever was waking up in its depths. The lights were failing in sequence, creating waves of darkness that chased us through the maze. Each time a section went dark, we could hear movement in the shadows. shapes that moved with purpose, hunting us with an intelligence that was both ancient and utterly alien. Behind us, the footsteps were getting closer, accompanied by sounds that no human throat should be able to make, breathing that came from multiple sources but maintained perfect synchronization. Voices that spoke in the same impossible language the creature had used, but distorted and multiplied until they created a cacophony of alien communication. And underneath it all, a scratching sound, like claws on concrete, but rhythmic and deliberate. Something was leaving marks on the walls as it followed us, creating a trail that others could follow. Evan was running behind us, his equipment still recording everything, when something reached out of a side passage and grabbed him. One moment he was there, documenting our escape. The next he was gone. We heard his scream echo through the facility, but it was cut short by a wet, tearing sound that made my stomach turn. "Evan!" Lila shouted, starting back toward where he'd been taken. I had to physically drag her forward, fighting her every step. "He's gone. If we go back, we're all dead." His camera lay abandoned in the corridor, cracked and sparking, but still functional. On the small screen, I could see the final moments of recording. Shapes moving in the darkness beyond our lights. Tall, pale figures with proportions that matched the casts we'd found in the mannequin room. They were real. They were alive. They were hunting us. And they had taken Evan somewhere into the depths of the facility for purposes I didn't want to imagine. We ran harder, pushing ourselves beyond exhaustion. The corridors seemed to stretch longer with each step, and the exits we'd marked on our way down were no longer where they should have been. The facility was actively working against us, rearranging itself to prevent our escape. When we passed through the mannequin room again, my worst fears were confirmed. All of the figures had moved. They were no longer arranged in their careful circles, but were positioned throughout the room, in a pattern that formed a clear path towards the central chamber, as if they were herding us back towards whatever we'd awakened. And as we ran past them, I saw several turn their featureless heads to follow our movement. Not the slight shifts I'd noticed before, but deliberate tracking motions that confirmed these weren't casts at all. They were something else wearing the appearance of casts, waiting for the right moment to reveal their true nature. And that moment was approaching fast. One of the figures near the exit raised its elongated arm as we passed, and I could see that the pale covering wasn't skin or synthetic material. It was some kind of biological membrane that moved and rippled with underlying muscle structure. These things were alive, had always been alive, and had been waiting in this room for decades for someone to trigger their activation. Dominic tried to seal the lower levels using an emergency lockdown system he'd found near the main elevator. He threw every switch and activated every protocol he could find, but it was too late. From the depths of the facility came a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Chanting, dozens of voices speaking in perfect unison in the same language the creature had used. It was mechanical and organic at the same time, like voices being played through speakers made of living tissue. The sound rose from every level of the facility, echoing through ventilation shafts and corridors we hadn't explored. But it wasn't random chanting. There was structure to it, rhythm and purpose that suggested ritual. They were performing some kind of ceremony, and we had been the catalyst that started it. The emergency lockdown systems Dominic had activated were having the opposite effect of what we'd hoped. Instead of sealing the lower levels, they seemed to be opening new passages, activating systems that had been dormant for decades. Throughout the facility, we could hear the sound of massive doors opening, mechanisms engaging, and power flowing to areas that had been dark. We made it back to the main corridor, but the exit seemed impossibly far away. The facility was fighting us now, the lights failing to create obstacles, the temperature dropping to levels that made every breath painful. Frost was forming on the walls and ceiling, and our exhaled breath created clouds so thick they obscured our vision. In the darkness between the flickering lights, I could see them. The pale figures from the mannequin room, keeping pace with us but staying just out of direct sight. They moved with a fluid grace that was both beautiful and terrifying, their elongated limbs allowing them to navigate the corridors in ways that human bodies never could. When we finally reached the entrance shaft, the metal stairs stretched upward like a ladder to salvation. But as we began to climb, I could hear them following. Not just footsteps, but the scraping of those impossibly long fingers against the concrete walls. The whisper of bodies moving through spaces too narrow for normal human anatomy. We climbed in desperate silence, not daring to look back at the sounds rising from below. Each step upward felt like a victory, but the sounds were getting closer. Whatever was following us could climb faster than we could run. Only when we reached the surface and I slammed the hatch shut did we allow ourselves to believe we might survive. I engaged every locking mechanism I could find, but even as I did, I could hear them on the other side, scratching at the metal, testing the seals, looking for weaknesses. But the world above had changed too. It should have been late afternoon, but the sky was the colour of old blood, and the forest around us was completely silent. No birds, no insects, no wind. Even our own voices seemed muffled, as if the air itself was absorbing sound. The trees looked different too, their branches reaching toward the hatch like gnarled fingers, and the hatch we'd just sealed was already showing signs of stress. The metal was warm to the touch, and I could see condensation forming around the edges. From below came a sound like breathing, but amplified and distorted until it sounded like wind rushing through a vast cavern. Something was trying to break out. We ran to our rental car and drove back toward Munich in absolute terror. The roads seemed different, longer than they should have been, and several times we passed the same landmarks multiple times, as if we were driving in circles. The GPS was malfunctioning, showing our location as constantly changing, even when we were stopped. During the drive, Lila kept checking her footage, and what she found made her start crying. The digital files were corrupted in ways that defied explanation. Faces were blurred beyond recognition, including our own. Audio played backward without any editing. Entire sections showed nothing but static, but if you listened carefully, you could hear voices speaking in that impossible language. But there was one file that remained intact, a single minute of footage from Evan's camera, recorded in the moments before he was taken. It showed the corridor where he'd been grabbed, but also something else in the background, barely visible in the shadows. A figure. Tall, pale, and moving, with deliberate purpose. It was one of the things from the mannequin room, but it was no longer pretending to be inanimate. It moved with intelligence, with hunting instinct, and it was looking directly at the camera with eyes that glowed with the same phosphorescence we'd seen in the central chamber. At the airport, we separated without saying goodbye. None of us wanted to discuss what we'd seen, as if talking about it might somehow call attention to us. But as I waited for my flight, I noticed other passengers staring at me strangely. A maintenance worker pointed at me and whispered to his colleague. A security guard kept watching me with eyes that seemed too pale, too knowing. The flight home was a nightmare of turbulence and mechanical problems. The pilot made 3 separate announcements about unusual atmospheric conditions that were affecting navigation systems. My seat neighbour, an elderly German man, kept staring at me with eyes that reminded me uncomfortably of the liquid mercury gaze of the creature in the chamber. When I tried to sleep, I dreamed of endless corridors and things that moved in the spaces between conscious thought. I dreamed of voices chanting in languages that hurt to hear, and of pale figures standing at the edges of my vision, always watching, always waiting. Back in my apartment, I tried to salvage what I could from our documentation, but the corruption was spreading. Files that had been intact when I first reviewed them were now showing the same distortions. Audio tracks were playing sequences I knew we'd never recorded. Video showed rooms we'd never entered and creatures we'd never encountered. But there was more than just corruption. New files were appearing on my computer, files I'd never created. They contained blueprints for the facility we'd explored, but also for dozens of other installations across Europe. The same architectural style, the same purpose, all connected by underground tunnels that stretched for hundreds of miles beneath the continent. A week after returning home, Lila stopped answering her phone. When I went to her apartment, the landlord said she'd moved out, suddenly in the middle of the night, leaving all her belongings behind. Her camera equipment was still there, arranged carefully on her desk, but every memory card had been wiped clean. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. On her desk, written in her handwriting, was a note. They called me home. The chanting never stopped. I have to go back to where I belong. Dominic lasted 2 weeks before he disappeared. His final message was a single text that arrived at 3:17 a.m. Sia komen, sia varni weg, die Kammer offnen sich. They're coming. They were never gone. The chambers are opening. When I tried to call him back, the number was disconnected. When I went to his apartment, it was empty, as if he'd never lived there at all. But on the wall, carved deep into the plaster, were the same symbols we'd seen throughout the facility, and they were glowing with a faint phosphorescence that pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat. Now, 3 months later, I'm alone, with a story no one will believe, an evidence that proves nothing to anyone but me. But I know what I saw down there. I know what we woke up, and I know it's not finished with us. The facility wasn't a Nazi research station. It was a prison, a containment system built to hold things that should never have existed. The Ahnenherber hadn't created those creatures. They had found them, studied them, and tried to harness their power for the Reich. But something had gone wrong in 1943, forcing them to seal the facility and abandon their experiments. Until we came along and opened the door. Every night since returning home, I hear that rhythmic chanting, even with all the power turned off in my apartment. It comes from the walls, from the floors, from the air itself. It starts softly, almost inaudibly, but grows louder as the night progresses until it fills my entire world with alien voices speaking words that reshape reality with their very pronunciation. My electronics malfunction constantly now. My phone makes calls to numbers that don't exist, connecting me to voices that speak in the same impossible language. My computer opens files I never created, filled with architectural plans for facilities I pray don't exist. My television shows static that resolves into images of underground chambers and pale figures moving through endless corridors. And sometimes when the chanting reaches its peak, I can see them in the corners of my room. Tall, elongated figures that stand perfectly still until I turn on the lights. Then they're gone, leaving only the faint smell of decay and the lingering sensation of being observed by intelligence that views humanity as we might view insects. I've tried to research the network of facilities shown in those mysterious blueprints, but every search leads to classified documents or records that have been sealed since the war. It's as if an entire shadow infrastructure was built across occupied Europe and then systematically erased from history. But I know it's real, and I know the creatures we encountered aren't limited to Kammer 12. The coordinates we found carved in that glass chamber, the blueprints appearing on my computer, the network of tunnels connecting installations across the continent. It all points to something vast and coordinated that was never fully contained. The dreams are getting worse. Not nightmares exactly, but something more insidious. Dreams where I'm walking back down those concrete stairs, not because I want to, but because something is calling me home. Dreams where I understand the chanting, where the alien language makes perfect sense and I find myself speaking, along with voices that come from throats that were never meant for human speech. In these dreams, I see the facility as it really is, Not abandoned ruins, but a living organism that extends far deeper than we ever explored. I see the creature in the central chamber, no longer contained, but free to move through corridors that stretch for miles beneath the earth. I see the pale figures that were never mannequins, multiplying and spreading through underground networks that connect every major city in Europe. And I see myself standing in that central chamber, my eyes sewn shut with black thread, my body elongated and modified, speaking in the same harmonic voices that had terrified me so much. But in the dreams, it doesn't feel like horror. It feels like coming home. The worst part is the growing certainty that our escape wasn't luck or skill. We were allowed to leave. We were meant to spread the word, to draw attention to what lies beneath that forest, because whatever was imprisoned in Kammer 12 doesn't want to stay hidden anymore. Last week, I received another envelope, same yellowed paper, same rusty ink that looked like dried blood. But this time the message was different. Not coordinates to a new location, but blueprints. Detailed architectural plans for expanding my apartment building's basement, connecting it to storm drains and utility tunnels that lead into the larger underground network. And at the bottom of the page, in handwriting, I recognized as my own, Kammer 13 wartet, du gehorst zu uns. Chamber 13 is waiting. You belong with us. I don't remember writing those words, but the ink was fresh and the handwriting was definitely mine. I must have done it during one of the blackouts I've been experiencing, periods where I lose hours at a time and wake up in places I don't remember going. Yesterday I found construction equipment in my apartment's basement. Professional-grade excavation tools, concrete cutting equipment and materials for underground construction. I don't remember ordering them, and my bank statements show no record of the purchases, but they're there, arranged as if someone has been planning extensive underground work. I should leave, should move somewhere far away and try to forget this ever happened. But I can't, because late at night, when the chanting gets so loud I can't think, I find myself in the basement with those tools, measuring distances, calculating angles, planning excavations that will connect my home to the vast network that lies beneath our world. The satellite imagery I check obsessively shows changes too, not just at the original coordinates, but at dozens of locations across Europe. Dark squares appearing in forest clearings, excavation sites that don't appear on any official construction records, and underground activity that suggests something vast stirring beneath the continent. The hatch at Kammer 12 is still open. I can see it clearly in high-resolution satellite photos, no longer hidden by forest canopy, but clearly visible as a dark square in the earth. And around it, the trees are dying in a perfect circle that expands a little more each day. But that's not the most disturbing part. The most disturbing part is the other hatches, dozens of them, appearing in the satellite imagery like a constellation of dark stars across the map of Europe, all open, all waiting. If you're reading this, if somehow this account finds its way to you, please understand what I'm trying to tell you. Don't look for the coordinates. Don't investigate the locations I've described. Don't try to verify this story through official channels, because the people who respond to those inquiries aren't entirely human anymore. The network is real. The creatures are real, and they're spreading. But if you do find an unmarked envelope containing blueprints for underground construction, if curiosity gets the better of you like it did me, then remember this. When you hear the chanting start, when the lights begin to fail and the pale figures start to move, don't try to understand what you're seeing. Don't read the inscriptions aloud. Don't wake up what's sleeping in the dark. Just run. Run as fast and as far as you can. And pray that whatever follows you home decides you're not worth the effort of conversion. Because the alternative is so much worse than death. The alternative is understanding that everything you thought you knew about human history, about human nature, about the fundamental nature of reality itself was wrong. The alternative is realizing that we were never alone on this planet, and that the things sharing it with us have been patient beyond human comprehension. The humming is getting louder as I write this. My computer screen keeps flickering, and I can see shapes moving in the reflection. I think they've found me. I think it's time to go home. The excavation in my basement is nearly complete. The tunnel connects to the storm drains now, and through those drains I can hear them calling. Voices that speak in harmonies that reshape reality with their very existence, calling me back to where I belong. If someone finds this story on my computer after I'm gone, know that I tried to warn you. Know that there are places in this world where humanity was never meant to go, and things that should never be disturbed. And know that somewhere beneath the forests of Bavaria, and beneath a dozen other locations across Europe, doors remain open that should have stayed sealed forever. They are still waiting, and now so am I. The chanting has stopped. In the sudden silence, I can hear footsteps in my basement. Long, measured strides that could only come from limbs that were never meant to be human. The construction is finished. The connection is complete. It's time to go home to Kammer 12 where I belong. Where I've always belonged. Where we all belong.